The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Jack Rogers, Editor-in-Chief of Business Facilities Magazine. I'm speaking to you from my home in Wayne Township, New Jersey. I want to welcome everyone to today's presentation of Business Facilities Livexchange webinar series. Today's presentation will focus on the labor market in a remote economy. Today's Business Facilities Livexchange webinar is sponsored by Santee Cooper, South Carolina state-owned electric and water utility. Before we get started, I know that everyone who's listening today wants us to take a moment to express our gratitude to America's healthcare workers who continue to wage a courageous and determined fight on the front lines against COVID-19. We thank all of these heroes. We also want to thank all of the attendees at this year's Livexchange event for their help in transitioning our annual event to a virtual venue this year. There are a few housekeeping items I just want to let you know about. The control panel on your screen is where you can submit questions using the question box. The orange arrow will expand the panel so you can access the question box. You can send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll try to answer as many as time permits. If you have any technical difficulties, just send us a message in the question box, and someone on our team will answer you privately. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, who comes to us from the great state of Idaho. Josh Wright is the Executive Vice President of Workforce and Economic Development at Emsi, the labor market analytics experts. Josh regularly writes and presents on data best practices and emerging trends in economic development and regional workforce analysis. For today's presentation, Josh has crunched the latest labor market data and analyzed some key indicators that can tell us which sectors have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, what the shape of the recovery looks like, and which workforce trends we can expect to play out moving forward. When Josh finishes his presentation, I'll have some questions for him, and we'll take some questions from our audience. And since he's coming from the great Northwest, I'll say good morning, Josh.
Thank you so much, Jack. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you to Business Facilities, and it's awesome to see this virtual format, just kind of be how you all have adapted in this world of obviously that we're all living in and going on what month 8 of this, really, if we think about as we go into October. We know it's a very hard time for everybody, but we appreciate you all joining us, and I'm excited to present about the labor market in a remote economy. So I'm going to get started here, go through. Here's a picture of me again, as Jack said. I work at Emsi, a labor market analytics firm. I've worked at Emsi for 12 years, former journalist, sports writer before that, and really blessed to be a part of a great data analytics company like Emsi and be able to see the viewpoints of how data is impacting communities across the country, how it can be a key part of the recovery as we go through COVID-19. So with that in mind, let me just give you a quick sense of what we're going to be talking about over the next 30 to 35 minutes. We're going to cover quite a bit of material, hopefully not go too fast. So if you do have questions, we certainly will take those at the end. Also happy to share these slides and share any resources that I talk about with you afterwards. My contact information will be available after this as well. So we're going to go through just a little bit about Emsi, what job postings have been telling us through this pandemic, talk about remote work and remote job postings, talk about the changing dynamic in cities and migratory trends, and then what to look for in a community response to COVID as we think about site selection, and then go into Q&A. Just a quick word about Emsi. Some of you all might know us as EMSI, or Economic Modeling Specialists International. We've been around for about 20 years. As Jack said, we're headquartered in Idaho, specifically Moscow, Idaho, just south of Spokane and Coeur d'Alene in the Pacific Northwest. About 250 employees, and our mission is to use labor market data to inform and connect 3 key audiences: people, education, and employers. And we do that specifically in the team that I lead, our community insights team, in the context of communities, regions, and states. And those players, the data really manifests itself differently across regions, as we all know. And so we'll be talking about that as we go through this presentation. The type of data that Emsi specializes in is core traditional labor market information from BLS, BEA, which is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Census Bureau. We also cull and mine and enrich millions of online job postings, over 100 million online resumes and profiles, and just last year opened up our skills library, open source skills library of 30,000 dynamic skills that we update every 2 weeks based off of those job postings and resumes to understand the supply and demand of what this, from a skills perspective of the labor market. We'll talk about the importance of that later as well. Just really quickly, Emsi works with communities across the country with using, some of whom use our software, some of whom use our consulting services, our API services that pipe right into their websites. So just a little bit of Emsi there. So let's jump into let's jump into the meat of the presentation here. Really wanted to give a lay of the land of what we've been seeing from the labor market through this. So this really went in mid-March, we started getting questions about, okay, shutdowns are starting to happen. We don't know what data to use. The 10-year projections from the BLS are already, we have to throw those out the window because this is a crisis like we've never seen before. Deeper in some ways than the Great Recession, maybe analogous to the Great Depression in the 1930s, but even then, it's just a totally unprecedented event. At the same time, we also have access to the different types of data than we've ever had. Really, in the last 5 years, there's been a proliferation of different types of real-time data, and we're seeing that in the months through COVID of different types of data as well, whether that's looking at restaurant seating in restaurants, whether that's looking at the mobile Google data to see how people are moving, whether that's looking at credit card data and Yelp, which does the reviews of businesses. They've crunched a bunch of business data to see which businesses are permanently closing, that type of a thing. There's a lot of great data at our hands. At the same time, there isn't what Emsi tries to do is provide as comprehensive a data across every geography in America. So that means every county, every zip code, census tract, all of that to understand what's happening locally for labor markets. And as we did that, the daily job posting activity, online job postings, companies, how are they, what are they posting, what are they not posting going through the pandemic, was a really early indicator, a bellwether of what the recovery could look like. And so this map right here is a look at across all MSAs, metropolitan areas and micropolitan areas, how job postings have changed from April through the end of August. We'll have September, we'll have a monthly report of September on our blog here in the first week of October. But what we can see here is that in nationally, we didn't see job postings start to get into the positive until probably early to mid-July. But in April, we could already see some local regional economies start to pop a little bit in the recovery. Some of it was modest, some of them are super hard hit. But as you can see here, a lot of blue we're starting to see from April to August in that time frame. The biggest growth areas, the darkest blue, Tulsa, Tampa, and Pittsburgh, all saw growth of the job postings between 48% to 53%. Tulsa and Tampa, 53% growth in job postings. Now, I will say, big caveat with this data, job postings don't mean that those are hires. A company can post a job online and not hire someone. They could post one job and hire 10 people. They could do 10 postings and hire one person. It's a tricky data set from that perspective, but there are some ways to couch that data that I'm happy to talk to you about if you're interested as well. Reno, for mid-sized cities here, we can see Reno and Stockton, California saw about 53% growth, similar to Tulsa and Tampa. Omaha, Nebraska actually has seen some really positive growth as well. But you can see some really negative declines, and that is specifically Las Vegas and some of the harder hit areas that are heavily dependent on hospitality, retail, that type of a thing. This next one shows from a different time frame. Let's zoom out a little bit. So instead of April to August, January to August, the change in job postings across the nation. And you can see a ton more red, not so much blue, which blue is indicating growth on this map. And you can see here, there were a couple, really, really dark red areas, actually more than a couple, but specifically Las Vegas. Las Vegas is probably the epicenter in some ways of this, just because of how dependent Las Vegas and quite a bit of the Nevada economy is on tourism, on gaming, those types of things that were just shut down and still haven't obviously fully recovered. Fresno, California, 31% decline from January through August. Las Vegas was 34%. Even more so, you don't see this on the map because we're just looking at the continental U.S. Honolulu, negative 41% decline in job postings from January through August. Laredo, Texas, Baton Rouge, Louisiana also have been really, really hard hit as well. Now, as we talked about this, job postings are starting to trend up. The recovery is starting to pop in a couple different areas. The economy is also in a very deep hole. A lot of devastation. A lot of what were temporary, what were called furloughs, have turned into permanent reductions. Those have been big headlines across major publications like the Wall Street Journal here. So there's quite a bit of news there about this. What we hoped was more of a temporary downturn. There was some hope of a quick recovery. This is turning into more permanent furloughs. But what we're really seeing is the different, not just from region to region, but also industry to industry sector. What we're going to talk more here in just a second about the K-shaped recovery that a lot of people are talking about. So you can see here, just in April alone, this was from the BLS jobs report, just in April alone, the devastation in leisure and hospitality, education and health services, and even some higher tech, higher wage, white collar positions like professional and business services. That industry took it really hard as well. Not as much decline in wholesale trade and transportation, but still a really kind of a picture of devastation across the board. Now, this is from a report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce called The K-Shaped Recovery and the Cost of Inaction. Really recommend reading this article. Happy to share a link to that. You can see here the notion of a K-shaped recovery being that the recovery is not going to look the same from industry to industry. And it really depends on what your regions or the regions you're looking at, if you're in the site selection world, of how dependent are they more tech focused? Are they more software service focused? Or are they more travel, entertainment, hospitality, and food services? And that notion of a K-shaped recovery we're starting to see that manifested in the employment numbers month over month here, whether you're looking at the BLS jobs report, which just gives you a national kind of preliminary data, or as we're looking at job postings. And back to our job posting numbers, this is a state level map. So it doesn't have the MSA view here, but you can see from January to August, just the real deep red, total decline across the board for accommodation and food service and arts and entertainment job postings. The biggest decline being in Louisiana and Nevada. Again, think of New Orleans, think of Las Vegas, huge centers for that's arts and entertainment jobs. The Southeast states like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, a little lighter red. Same for the Dakotas, Montana, and Washington. A little bit of the Northeast, it's a mixed bag as well. So that just gives you obviously through a lot of data out there, could certainly share a lot more, but just a lay of the land of what's happened as we've gone week over week, month over month here through the pandemic. Another thing that we've been tracking is just this whole nature of what's happening with remote work. And job postings are also an interesting indicator of that too. One way that we can look at job postings is basically to filter out to see specific jobs that denote these are work from home or remote specific jobs, and we can tag those job postings with that. There's also a lot of jobs that, because of the nature of the shutdown, that the work from home is just going to be inherent in this, so that these numbers are probably muted from that perspective. But what we looked at here, and this trend is showing with the green line, is that job postings that are, where a company is indicating on the online job ad that it is a remote position, there is those positions are up 106% from pre-COVID average. So just a huge growth in remote positions. And of course, this really changes again, metro to metro, what kind of industries, where the businesses are located that are posting those positions. But in some ways, we're seeing a flattening of the geographic landscape in the sense of you have, even if you do have a traditionally heavy manufacturing center, but if there is someone who lives there and can work remotely for Microsoft, for Google, for a tech startup, or for professional services firm, that in some ways is changing the game of both site selection and just how economic developers should be thinking about community development. This is the top remote, just a list of the top occupations that have been posted from March to August. Which companies are posting occupations that have the highest percentages of remote work. Insurance, software, customer service reps, you get a sense here of the types of occupations that companies are saying, we want remote workers here. And on the far right, you can see how long it's taking those positions on average or in a median sense, how long it's taking for those postings to be filled or how long they're up on those company sites or on the job boards. So a real mix of software developers is not taking 16 days to 31 days for insurance sales reps. Posting intensity is really just a ratio of how many total postings are being posted versus how many we deduplicate. A lot of duplicate job postings come out. MZ takes, our data scientists go through a rigorous process to deduplicate those postings so that we can give as meaningful information on those job postings as possible. Okay. Much more could be said on just the whole nature of remote work, but what I want to touch on really that ties into that trend of remote work is this difference in disruption and migration trends and how we even think about cities moving forward. Much has been made about big tech companies in Silicon Valley saying, telling their employees, you know what, you can work from home till June 2021, or if you want to move, a lot of them picking up and leaving Silicon Valley because of how expensive it is to live in those cities, how hard it is to find housing, traffic, traditionally, even though right now traffic flows, of course, are way down, but how just people being tired of traffic. This is really what, I think what we could easily call a perfect storm for the changing makeup of the geographic makeup of the U.S. I will say, as I look forward to this, I've been privileged in my time at MZ to work both with Joel Kotkin and with Richard Florida on different research, and they both use MZ data for different things, whether you're looking at newgeography.com or City Lab for Richard Florida. But I'm not an urbanist, but I will say I think the death of cities is definitely overplayed in my mind. There's been a lot of talk about that in past. But we are facing.
Did you see? Excuse me. Did you see Jerry Seinfeld's op-ed on that?
Yes, I did.
In the New York Times, where he addressed all the people who were leaving New York.
Absolutely, Jack. And it was I think a lot of people rallied around that just from the sake of how resilient New Yorkers are. But if you think about it, the advantages of being in cities are certainly there. Will certainly still be there. At the same time, I think we will see the nature of site selection, the nature of commercial real estate, and other things be changed for the long haul, if not permanently, based off of what's happened in the pandemic. We can't underestimate that as well. So I know that's probably straddling both sides a little bit there, but I don't think the death of cities is imminent. At the same time, the commercial real estate market and the site selection market are definitely going to be changed and have to adapt because of this, just like every company and every individual. But one of the things I also want to stress here is that the pandemic, COVID-19, has really accelerated trends that we started to see or people started to express in different polls like this 2018 Gallup poll, where people were already expressing this, only 15% of Americans living in rural areas in 2018, but 27% saying they wanted to live in rural areas. Same for the dynamic, not as abruptly between big city suburbs or small cities, actually going the other way. So there is moving is a costly thing, both emotionally for people because of their networks of friends and family, and just the cost it takes to move. And so it's been well documented for years that actually the percentage of people that have moved state to state, interstate migration, or across state borders has been declining for decades. Now, at the same time, the pandemic, as we saw pretty quickly, people flooded out of big cities just because of the health crisis, and because they wanted, to flee the cities at least temporarily. We'll have to see how that trend looks like. I will say we won't fully know about this, just putting my data nerd hat on. The key migration data sets are from the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and the ACS, the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau. Both of those lag at least a year to 2 years. And so we will not fully know from a data perspective the full scope of this for several years. And of course, there's also going to be cities that are still recovering or trying to recover 2 or 3 years down the road from the pandemic, if not 5 or 10 years down the road. Some of the research that Emsi has done has shown that even from the Great Recession, 4 out of 10 cities had not returned to their employment levels of 2007 when the pandemic hit, if we look at 2019 job numbers. So the big crises like this take a long time to recover from. Some are already starting to do it, but the question is what to look for a community response. This segues really nicely into the final portion of my talk here, and happy to take questions on any of the data we've shown, any of these trends, but really what I want to talk about here is what to look for in a community's response to COVID. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. So if you're a site selector, if you're a consultant, or if you're a community putting your hat on and saying, what is a site selector looking for in our community? 3 questions to ask yourself. Whether you can ask yourself for your own community, your own region, or again, if you're trying to look at where should we think about, or help our clients think about going coming out of the pandemic. Number 1, did the community, did the region make data-informed decisions? Did they prepare themselves and lead through the crisis and really start to adapt and take quick action? This is an example of a COVID-19 rapid response, rapid employment dashboard that Emsi's created that different cities have adopted, but to look at both COVID-19 trends, deaths, cases, but also real-time impacts on industries, companies, job postings from companies, careers, all that kind of thing. Many regions have put these kinds of rapid response dashboards so that they can all get on the same page, so that the chambers, the EDOs, the cities, the mayor's offices are leading with data and making sure that they're understanding the dynamics as they go through this. How the quality of these decisions likely depends on the quality of information they've had at that time. Now, you're not going to make a huge 12-month or 5-year strategic plan based off of a daily change in job postings or what 1 month of unemployment data is showing you, but it's certainly, as the dust settles, communities and their leaders really need to be making even more rapid response data-informed decisions, because this is such a rapidly evolving time frame, or just world we're living in right now. Number 2, the second question is, how is your community, or if you're a site selector looking at communities, how did they align their training and education for the skills economy? This has been something that Emsi spent a lot of time on, because we've we have that open source skills library. We're building applications and understanding mapping the labor market from a skills perspective. But as we think about from a community lens, a huge component that site selectors have always been talking about for years, the number 1 factor has been workforce development, making sure that regions that are competitive from a training perspective have really high quality community colleges, whether that's adaptable, really short-term training programs, or robust 4-year graduate degree type level universities. Those are very attractive to companies for obvious reasons. But as communities, have attempted to rapidly re-employ their workers, if a community has a disjointed workforce system, that's become painfully obvious through this. And really, again, as we think of COVID-19 as an accelerant, as that trend, as my friend John Roberts and Tracy McDaniels from TIP Strategies put on the Develop This podcast just a couple weeks ago, COVID-19 has been more of an accelerant than introducing new trends. And the trend that for years communities have known that they needed to make a more adaptive, real-time workforce development system. And this has become really painfully clear through COVID-19. So as you evaluate communities, or as you evaluate your own community, some of the questions asked are do we understand the real skill sets that have been resilient through this, that are now more in demand than ever? Maybe that's digital skills, maybe that's more healthcare skills. What are those skills that are that we need to be thinking about, and what are the skills coming out of our training programs? As we think about the labor market, why Emsi is making such a big deal about skills is beyond occupations, beyond industries. Something that site selectors were also starting to indicate months and years before the pandemic was skills are really the language of the labor market. It's how industries, companies, and educators talk to each other, or should be talking to each other. It's how what people should be evaluating their own competencies, their own qualifications based off of. Do they have the skills relevant for companies? And communities, the more that communities can understand their capacity to develop particular skills and understand from the gaps and opportunities based off those skills, the better they're going to be. So number two is aligning. First was leading with data. Second, aligning with their training and education for the skills economy. What are the skills taught in their courses at their 2-year, even CTE programs in their K-12 system, 2-year programs, the 4-year programs? What are the skills taught? How are those mapping to the labor market? Part of this is implementing systems to align the training. This is something Emsi is helping with, as well as we work with community colleges, universities, and regional systems to pull out the skills, map the skills of their educational content and make them adaptive to local labor market trends. Okay, so I've talked about the first two questions. The third question as I wrap up here is, did the community you're evaluating develop ways to connect job seekers and employers based off of those skills? Again, skills data really unearths the competencies possessed by all workers. Now, it doesn't tell you, someone could put a skill on their job post, on their resume, and you don't know, how do we validate that the person has that skill? We get that question all the time. There are different ways to do that. There are different assessments. There are different things that an employer is going to have to, judge for themselves as they go through an interview process with an individual. At the same time, this communities, we're seeing more and more of them play the role of matchmaker, matching companies with talent and helping individuals inventory the skills that they have and that they want, to see how their skills right now align to the labor market, and then identify the gaps where they need to say, okay, I've got to reskill or upskill here. One of the great things that I've seen, if you scroll through LinkedIn day over day, like many of us have through the pandemic, you can see how many people have taken Coursera or Udemy or edX classes. How many people have gone and said, you know what, how many of those training providers have offered up free courses that people say, this is an opportunity. I'm holed up at home. It's an opportunity for me to say, where do I want to go in my career? How do I need to adapt individually? Communities are saying the same thing, or should be saying the same thing if they're not. How should we adapt as a community? We may specialize in these type of traditional manufacturers who have some more old school skills. What are those new advanced manufacturing skills that we need to make sure we're cultivating in our workforce system so that we can stay competitive? So with that in mind, again, the skills landscape, understanding the skills landscape, both regionally, for individuals, for companies, for education providers, is something that I think the biggest talking point as we look at moving forward from the pandemic. You can see this is my email here. Really appreciate everyone's time, and I'm happy to answer questions or go deeper on any of these things.
Well, thanks a lot, Josh. That was a really thought-provoking presentation. A lot of those numbers raised my eyebrows. We have a bunch of questions for you. First of all, in terms of making data-informed decisions, particularly in the context of site selection, a lot of people rank locations, and when they create rankings for locations, sometimes they use a location quotient, which is basically a simple algorithm that accounts for the size of the state. It sort of equals the playing field. So you can compare lower population states like Idaho with states like California and New York. And I'm wondering, and also in the early days of the pandemic, everybody seemed to have the idea that the epidemic was rising and falling across the country at the same time, when as we now know, it's more like wildfires happening at different places with different intensity. So what I'm wondering is, and I see on your slide, you had a pull down for COVID-19. Are there data points or factors related to a location's response to COVID-19 that should be evaluated when you're evaluating workforce for a candidate location today?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jack. And you're right. Traditionally, Emsi provides these. You can get this from the BLS and others. Location quotient of whether it's looking at industry and occupation, how concentrated is an industry and occupation in your municipality, in your state, in your region. And moving forward, there have been, it's been a really interesting test case through COVID-19 of how data is visualized and communicated from leaders. And you see really good examples of that in different states and regions, and maybe some areas where it's been harder to get data, or data has been communicated maybe in a less than ideal way. One thing that we created pretty early on, I didn't talk about this, was an Emsi Health Risk Index to evaluate counties and Tier 1, Tier 2 MSAs based off of 4 different factors, including precondition population health variables, how closely, the proximity effect of how closely. There's a great data set called ONET from the BLS or the ETA that looks at, has a bunch of different knowledge, skills, and abilities of occupations. One thing that they do is look at the physical proximity of jobs. So if you have an industry where people have to work in close proximity, like a meat packing plant, if regions have more concentration in those industries, those ranked higher in our health risk index. But there were a couple other factors we looked at, but we happy to share that information. But basically, I think as we
Josh,
yeah.
Excuse me. I was thinking more in terms of factoring in their response to the crisis. I'll give you an example. Okay. We have a number. All of the economic development organizations have really been the conduit for the relief that's gone out. And they've also been very proactive in setting up new supply chains, particularly for medical equipment and personal protective equipment. But a lot of them have established incentives programs that augment the federal aid, and they've come together to form regional partnerships that maybe weren't as robust before, but now they're essential. Are you incorporating that kind of response into your evaluation of locations, or should site selectors be doing that?
I think short answer is absolutely. And some of that you can't just get with the type of data we're talking about. Some of it is to similarly like the mix of art and science or qualitative and quantitative data that any site selector would do as they evaluate communities, or whether that's looking at workforce data and then going on the ground and looking at what are the actual programs, workforce training programs look like. The same with, you could look at the COVID data, you can look at health risk indicators, but then you can go look and say, how did they adapt? How did they take their federal funds? How did they take state funds? How did they create innovative programs to really assist businesses? How do and talking to those individual businesses in the communities as you evaluate those communities is going to be a key part of that.
Well, I want to go back to that pretty sobering slide you showed about the Q-shaped recovery, and I think your comment about how the pandemic has really accelerated certain trends. Well, I think we're seeing that the trend that we had before the pandemic, that we were really developing into a two-tiered economy, is certainly has speeded up. We see it's almost like the economy is disconnected from gravity here. Certainly the stock market is, but we can see that there are certain sectors that are actually thriving in the pandemic. Certainly the the e-commerce and tech sector. But my question really is, is a K-shaped recovery even possible if the bottom third of the economy is crushed and is going to take much longer to recover? Is that going to pull the rest of it down, or are we seeing the emergence of what we've entitled this a real remote economy?
I think we have seen that emergence, and I also would say that, I mean, if I could answer yes, if it's possible to answer yes to both of those, I would say so, because I think there's been some interesting research already about the supply, with the absolute, the fleeing of urban centers, the fact that workers aren't going into huge office buildings, that is having a material impact on restaurants, the food carts, the services that came around that depended on the thousands of people coming into those cities to work from 8 to 5 and, going out to lunch, getting things done. And because of that, that's had a huge impact. So there's going to be a ripple effect, even as professional and business services, offices, accounting offices, whatever it might be, go more to remote. There is a ripple effect. Now, that does mean that, yeah, absolutely, the likes of Amazon, other e-commerce sites, Shopify, there's huge growth in the stocks of those companies. And then there's going to be other ones that rely on more of that face-to-face that are going to suffer. But but even inside the broader sectors like retail, it really depends on, are we talking about online retail or, obviously large mall shopping centers have been in decline for years. So it really depends. You can't I think the big takeaway here is you can't just say one big sector and make a blanket statement, or one region make a statement. It's going to be nuanced no matter what we're talking about.
Well, I also think, this is just my opinion, but I think there's going to be a social factor here that may pull us in the other direction. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, certain businesses can do without business travel. They can have virtual events, or other businesses can have everybody work at home. It's certainly easier if you're already working in a digital environment. But then when you turn around and you look at the impact of society, of hotels closing and airlines going bankrupt, at some point it turns into it's almost your patriotic duty to take a business trip. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but there is going to be the changes that you're talking about really raise fundamental questions about the structure of the economy, don't they?
They do, absolutely. And I do think there's going to be permanent, both whether you call it scar tissue or some changes for the better, and maybe, that one part of the residue could be, a lot of families being more tight-knit because they have more time together. There's also the major issues of mental health and other issues coming out because of the shutdowns and things like that. So there's two sides to that. I also say on the remote side of things, I personally believe, I know a number of companies, just whether they're our clients, they're consultants in the economic development space or whatever, who are actually got rid of their office space. And I understand that for the short term, but I really do believe long term, there's still going to be, for creative brainstorming, for teamwork, for other things, people are going to be whether it's a 50-50 split, working primarily from home or whatever, or primarily from work, people are going to want to be face-to-face. And that same thing for conferences. Virtual conferences have been great this year, but I also know there's a lot of Zoom fatigue happening. People tapping out of, you could go to a conference like Livexchange and have 8 hours of, really quality conversation, go to a reception, that type of thing. I think there's a lot of conferences who get, if they're lucky, if they get 2 to 3 hours of attentiveness from participants now, just because it's really hard to look and stare at a computer for that long.
Well, I guess, to boil my statement down to a nutshell is I don't think we can, while certain industries may be downsized considerably as a result of this, we may, at some point, for the economic health of the country, we may have to prop them up. I'm not saying, look, we hope that there's more relief coming and that we don't have to create make-work jobs like WPA and that kind of thing. But I think there's also going to be a push to, we're not going to be able to get back to normal, but, we're going to have to support some of these sectors. I mean, we've already bailed the airlines out. So that's where I was going with that.
Sure.
I do want to ask you, you mentioned the migration, and especially since, and you explained to me before the presentation that just because you're in Idaho doesn't mean you're next door to Boise. You're actually 4 hours away near the Canadian border. It's a very very long state vertically. But Boise is a hot city right now. It's a tech hub, and it's what we've called in the trade press a millennial magnet. Now that's also a trend that was happening before the pandemic. So the question is that I mean, I agree with you that this is the end of New York City stuff is overdone, but is this going to accelerate these mid-market, the trend of millennials who want the quality of life, they want the 24/7 hip kind of atmosphere, but they want lower cost? Is this going to accelerate the attraction of these mid-market cities?
I think so. I think it's going to be an accelerant for certain type, like not just the millennial, but also as millennials start to age into wanting to buy homes and start families, you start to see, there's quite a bit of research that shows that a lot of those look toward the suburbs, toward those kind of more affordable cities where they can get good school, be in good school districts, have access to hiking trails and bike trails but also be really close to a pretty thriving downtown scene if they want, as bars and restaurants open up as well. So I think you are going to see that. I also, I would say just from a site, it's going to be really interesting. From a site selection and economic development perspective, we already know there's been, Emsi's we're about to release our fifth annual talent attraction scorecard, where we rank every county based off of how well they're attracting talent. Talent attraction has been a trend in a big thing in economic development for some time. I really believe looking at data from a place of residence versus a place of work perspective is going to become a huge trend, even more than it is now, because you're going to start to realize talent pools. It's not just from a company perspective, but there's going to be individual, really talented people, maybe even clustering together, who are going to be like talent clusters versus company or industry clusters are going to become more of a thing. And it's going to, in how cities can adapt and how they even incentivize how site selection works from that perspective is also, I think, going to be pretty fascinating to watch unfold.
Do you think talent attraction still comes under the rubric of workforce development, or are there different elements of the push to get locations, whether it's incentive to get projects for locations, whether it's incentives or infrastructure? Is this going to become an across-the-board effort, or does it still go hand in hand with workforce training and finding skilled labor?
Well, that's a fascinating topic on its own. Like, how much melding are we seeing between traditional economic development and traditional workforce development? I think the best regions are going to be, and what we've seen through the pandemic, is higher education, K-12 system, workforce development, economic development, all coming together. We also saw for the last few years remote programs like Remote Tulsa, Vermont's program to attract remote workers, different levels of success there. I think to answer your question at a finer point, I think it really is going to be an amalgam of things depending on the region. It's hard to say that the traditional site selection as seen as they look at even an HQ2 process for Amazon looking the same in 2020. If something happened like that in 2021, I would say it would look pretty different in 2021 compared to what it looked like in 2017.
Well, of course, since they canceled one of those, I'm calling it like H1.5. And does
right.
Seattle still count as a headquarters? I'm a little confused as to what they actually did there, but I guess we'll call it HQ2.
Right, and Amazon has since announced a big investment in different cities for office space, which I think that's telling you Amazon sees like, hey, a lot of people are, a lot of office space available. Let's take advantage of that, and also helping or going to cities where that finish just below that, below New York and the Northern Virginia area in the HQ2 process. Amazon's also doubling down and growing in Bellevue, just outside of Seattle as well. So there is. Again, I would not say site selection as we know it is going to fundamentally change, but I do think there is going to be permanent changes in how we evaluate locations and how communities need to evaluate themselves and how we incentivize economic development from based off of place-based strategies, workforce programs, equitable growth, all those types of things that are going to become more and more of a thing.
Well, one of the other trends that was happening before the pandemic was, I guess, for lack of a better word, I'd call it regionalization. And by that, I mean that the old days of towns across the river from each other duking it out for a project have really, in many places, been replaced by a regional approach where you bring all of the regional assets to bear, and it's all coordinated. And certainly your discussion before about the industrial centers plays into this. I mean, it's the industry that's going to drive the way, facilities and expansions are developed. So do you think we're going to see we're going to see less competition? And that's why I sort of scoff at the HQ2 approach of a national lottery. But we're going to see less competition. We're going to see more regional cooperation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think as regions, again, pandemic has forced a lot of collaboration and partnerships just for the survival of not just for survival, but how do we adapt? How do these regions adapt? And there's always going to be fights between municipalities, and borders are always going to be thick in some ways. At the same time, the help, like individuals as they evaluate, let's think from a talent attraction perspective, if you have a broader region, let's say in a 45-minute radius, there is a great lake over here, but there's a great shopping center over on the other side, and there's a great business core in the middle. Individuals probably thinking abroad, they're going to think about their neighborhood, but they're also going to think about the broader region they're moving to. Same for companies, because they're going to have to attract the talent to that region, or they're going to have to say, what, we're going to be making sure we're how remote heavy we are. We're going to have to think about still, we're going to have something, how much of a presence are we going to have in that region? And so regional, I think the growth, I think we're just going to see more growth of regionalism from the pandemic. I don't think that's I think that was already happening, and whether it accelerates or not, honestly, not 100% sure, but I think it's definitely a thing. It's definitely going to be a factor.
Well, since you're a data guy who's quite familiar with government statistics, presentation of government statistics in websites like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think Herbert Hoover designed the website for that, and the codes that are used. But seriously, we're going to need precise data more than ever before, especially in this kind of an unprecedented crisis. But then you look at something like an emerging growth sector like cybersecurity, which it's got to have. They haven't filled all the jobs because we need the skills, but there's more than 1 million jobs in there, and yet the government can't track it. It's 15 different job descriptions, and you can't get a snapshot of it. Is the government up to the task of giving us the vital information of the type that you evaluate, or are they going to have to up their game?
I think they're going to have to up their game, to be frank. And we're, MZ, we partner and talk a lot to the BLS and the BEA about their data sets, their new data products, You know, whether it's looking at GDP at the county level or looking at a time series of occupational statistics. The challenge that for the government, first and foremost, I should say, the U.S. has the best labor statistics in the world. We have, it's a big advantage that you can go in and look by county at a lot of data. You can look at by state, even better data. But there are challenges because there's a lot of lag in a lot of the data sets. They're old, they get old very quickly. And like you said, emerging skill sets like cybersecurity, data science, AI, those types of things are just simply baked into traditional industries and occupations, and you have no idea how to parse those with the occupation and industry codes. That's why Emsi is, and why as we even talk about what's the future of labor market information, skills is we firmly believe is that future. And that's not just skills from like an ONET knowledge, skills, and abilities side of the things, but an adaptive, not even a taxonomy, but a library of skills that changes over time based off of how businesses adapt. And I would say on the cybersecurity front, we just released a big research paper about this. We found that for every 100 job openings, active postings for cybersecurity, the U.S. only has 48 qualified candidates. And those issues are really
it's a big crisis.
It's a huge issue.
And it doesn't help when the NSA lets somebody walk out the door with all of our cyber tools. So we've got a big skills gap there. But I think they're also going to have to. I mean, you're probably even looking at this at this point, but you almost have to redefine what the term tech jobs means. I mean, every machine tool has a CNC controller on it. It's all advanced manufacturing. Are those tech jobs? You know, it's. I think we're going to have to get a lot more specific in how we define these things. Now, I've got we had a question. We had a question from the audience here about whether the slides would be available, and yes, we can. We can send you Josh's deck of slides when we're done here. I guess my last question for you here, since we're closing in on the time limit, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but we talk K-shape. Obviously, it's not going to be a V shape. But do you think, assuming, and we all hope this, that we get a vaccine pretty quickly and it starts getting distributed, are you seeing as difficult a recovery as we had in the financial crisis? I think you mentioned 4 out of 7 jobs weren't recovered. What was it, within 10 years? Do you think we're facing something like that? Or if we take out the virus, that, it's going to be a different economy. It's going to be a strong economy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be more of the latter. At the same time, I'm not an economic forecaster, so I will say, and also not a futurist. And of course, no one can predict it. But depending on how the vaccine comes, how resilient, our economy is really resilient. And if you look at it from a national economy perspective, you're going to see things that you also just don't see that's already happening on the surface. Different MSAs, different metro areas, different regions are already really starting to change how they think, how the companies work, whether it's led by the industry, those key industry leaders, or that's led by community leaders, or both. There is a lot of really great things already happening that just don't get national attention. At the same time, I think you're going to see the stat I used earlier was in our research, 4 out of 10 cities had not recovered fully from the Great Recession at the end of 2019. And so
wow. That's a really shocking statistic.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is, and it really depends on, again, industry mix, leadership, everything. I'm more and more convinced, whether you're talking about a basketball team or a business or a community, everything boils down to leadership. And what communities have great leadership that are saying, you know what, we've got to focus right now on upskilling and reskilling in digital skills. We've got to understand, like you said, a real great sense of what are those tech and digital skills. And that doesn't just mean software. It means manufacturing, production, and engineering. And it means and taking a really collaborative approach from all of that for a network, to build a network to make the workforce of the future. The communities that do that have great companies, have great community leaders, are going to get out ahead a lot quicker. We saw that happen after the Great Recession. A lot of communities start to lap other communities. And it's, as much as we talk about federal policy and federal national, that absolutely has an impact. The election is going to have an impact here, but community, from mayor's offices to governor's offices, states and cities it's going to look drastically different, in my opinion.
Well, and speaking of leadership, we get to pick our leaders this year, so it's a very timely discussion. Josh, I want to thank you for a really thought-provoking presentation. We've got a lot to think about. I want to thank our audience for attending today. Today's Business Facilities Livexchange webinar was sponsored by Santee Cooper, South Carolina state-owned electric and water utility. A recording of today's webinar will be available on the businessfacilities.com website, and if you're registered to attend next week's Business Facilities Livexchange event, the on-demand recording will also be available on the Livexchange event site throughout the event from September 28th to the 30th. I want to invite everybody to join us at our next Business Facilities Livexchange webinar, which will be our Livexchange Keynote, taking place on Monday, September 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The keynote will be on reshoring in 2021, outlook and strategies, and it will be presented by Rosemary Coates, the Executive Director of the Reshoring Institute. So we hope you'll all join us then. And once again, thank you for attending this webinar, and have a great afternoon.